Welcome to the podcast. Eric is the autobiography of my granddad, Eric Langridge. He was born in Lambeth, London, 1925. His early days were filled with poverty and a great deal of unhappiness, though he found joy where he could. Though young, he'd already gone through a great many changes in his life, and in this episode we see another great change was on the horizon. One day I was placed in George's care to learn a new item of farming. George explained that the hay meadows were beginning to flourish, so preparations had to be made. I went with him to the stables and watched as he harnessed Farmer and Blossom. The pieces of harness he was putting on looked very heavy. A huge collar was placed over their heads, and then what looked like a huge leather block on their back. They had a blanket on to protect them from the block rubbing. Then there was a huge leather piece of harness placed on their rumps. All of these pieces linked together with straps and chains. They both looked magnificent, with the leather highly polished and with the brass and chains gleaming. He backed them out of their stalls, and they seemed to make their own way out. George allowed me to lead Blossom, and we headed off into a field where there was a huge wagon standing. George then hooked them up to the wagon, and we were ready for work. I climbed up on the wagon, and away we went. It was so exhilarating, I even jumped down now and again to open up and close gates. We eventually entered into a wood spinney, where there were faggots of wood lying about, which we loaded up onto the wagon. When George thought we had had enough, we went off again to the hay meadow. It was all very intriguing. I really thought this was the life, and made up my mind that one day I was going to be a carter. We went through 2 further fields next to the hay meadow, where we stopped. George told me to stop working. Now it was lunchtime. He gave me a small linen bag. Inside was a large slice of bread and a lump of cheese with a small pickled onion. What a surprise. Having worked so hard, I was bound to enjoy this sack lunch, and I did. It was smashing. He also produced a bottle of mild cider. George explained that this was his usual lunch, and now that I was a worker, I could have some too. While we ate, George explained what we were about to do. This was the spot where the hay rick would be built. But first we had to clear the ground of weeds, etc., and then lay out faggots of wood like a raft. This was to assure there would be ample air circulation underneath, so the rick wouldn't catch fire. Apparently, the center of a rick gets very, very hot. George was very methodical in his work, making sure there were enough gaps to keep the rick well ventilated. In the meantime, Farmer and Blossom had their nose bags on and were quite contented and looking so peaceful. As we finished, we made our way back to the yard, leaving the cart in the field. We then walked the horses to another barn, and George hitched them up to a grass cutting machine, which we took into the hay meadow. We also took 2 other types of machinery as well, and now we were ready to start cutting. It was time for me to get back to the yard now, ready for me to help with milking, and time for George to unharness the horses and tuck them up for the night. I had thoroughly enjoyed my day, and when we all sat down for our meal, the farmer asked George how we had managed. George was very kind and gave me great praise for being so helpful. I felt so proud. After tea, it was still daylight, so I was allowed out to explore further. I went up to the first meadow to meet Bossy Boots and had a chat with him. He was quite placid now, and I felt he had accepted me into the fold. Then I and my 3 canine companions went into the long meadow to romp and play. There were lots of rabbits running around, and Jack was soon gone. The bees and birds were all very busy, and there was a sense of tranquility everywhere. We went on all along the hedgerows looking for signs of rabbit warrens and bird nests. I saw a stoat for the first time, and also noticed the skylarks. It was now time to go in for supper and bed. It had been a great day. Next morning I was up early again, and after milking and breakfast, I had to clean out the cattle sheds, after which the farmer would give me my job for the day. Every morning after breakfast, there was a ritual that took place which fascinated me. The farmer had cut off 2 slices of bread and then spread it thickly with fresh cream. He then cut it up into small pieces and walked through the corridor into the barn. He then scattered it on the floor and fed the cats. I had no idea there were so many. My job for today would be hoeing the weeds out between the rows of marigolds. It was the same procedure as before, 4 paces width between 2 canes, and we worked across the field. But it was huge, and this task would last at least a week or more depending on the weather. I hated this job. It was tedious and backbreaking. There were jobs that had to be done, even though it might be raining. We were well protected in such an event. The farmer used to do all his own threshing of corn, so therefore had a vast quantity of sacks in store. Some were made of rough hessian, which would be used for potatoes. There were others that were quite heavy and very finely woven. These were called West of England socks, which were originally owned by that company, but circulated through the farms. These sacks were our waterproof clothing. One was tied around our waist, and the other around our shoulders. They had strings through them for tying on and were extremely comfortable and warm. Of course, if the weather was too bad to work, I had a job in the dry, in the barn, mending sacks. Fortunately, my training by Miss Polly came in very useful here, and I could darn the sacks very neatly once I got used to the sack needle. Another item I got used to were the leather gaiters I had to wear. Very good protection against thistles and brambles, or bossy boots if he got spiteful during the times his girls were laying eggs. It came the day when the farmer explained that we had to get the equipment ready for the start of grass cutting. The machinery was oiled and chains tightened. The blades, which were removed, were being sharpened by George and the farmer. They each had a stone in their hands and were continually rubbing the blade back and forth. I could see how sharp they were becoming. They looked lethal. The farmer was also sorting out various sizes of hay forks and wooden hay rakes. It all looked very exciting. We then took a final walk through the meadow looking for thistles again. It had been another interesting day, and after milking, we all went in for tea. As we sat around the table, final plans were being discussed, and I was included. The wife had cooked a wonderful bacon and onion pudding, which had been left to simmer all day long over the log fire. It was lovely, but yet again tasted of wood smoke. I then went out to make sure the chickens and geese were safely put away. Once again I had the company of my 3 friends. Old Bossy Boots and his girls were no problem, but some of the chickens seemed to be carried away with their scratching and searching for food. Little Jack was a great help. While he rummaged about for rabbits, he would let me know if a chicken had set up a nest in the hedge. If so, she would have to be collected along with her eggs, which were placed into a broody coop. I was very upset one day when I went into the barn and saw 2 of my chickens hanging up dead. Next day was the start of grass cutting. George had harnessed the horses to the grass machine and off they went into the meadow to make their first cut. The machine was very noisy, with all the rattling of chains and blades. The horses took it all in their stride, and there was no word of command necessary from George, just the tension on the ropes. Once the first cut had been made, the farmer and I moved in to rake the grass to one side, so that it wouldn't get trampled on the return cut. This went on until the field had been completed. It was very hard work. The grass was now left in rows to dry in the sun and warm air. And then George had another machine with which he turned it all over. All through this I was learning. On the day that it was decided to collect the hay, there were 2 or 3 different men who appeared on the scene. George explained that these were neighbouring farmers who came to help. One had brought 2 horses. One pair was harnessed to a mechanical rake, and the hay was gathered into large heaps. It was our duty to load it up onto the carts. Our 2 horses were pulling 1 hay cart each, which when loaded were taken to the raft George had built for the haystacks. While the men carried on loading hay, I was left at the rick with George. We started laying the hay onto the raft until it had reached about 4 feet high. At that point, George stayed up on top and I continued to pass the hay up to him. It was easy until it got too high, and I was getting showered with the hay. It fell on my hair and down my back, which was very uncomfortable. Eventually the rick was the right height, and the thatcher moved in. By the time all of this was completed, the wife had cooked a wonderful dinner, and we all sat down at the table, about 10 of us. I was a worker among workers. During the harvesting season, we used to get a lot of strange visitors looking for work. They were very kindly old gents, and I used to listen to them for ages in the barn as they told about old times. They were all tramps and they would work their way from farm to farm earning their keep. The farmer provided a corner of the barn where they could stay. He had built a covey in the corner out of straw bales. And what was really interesting was when one of them told me to walk up to the front gate and I would see a tree with a white cross chalked on it. This was to advise other tramps that this was a good farm to stop at, and apparently this was the unwritten code used by these unfortunate men. We had another visitor every year who was a scruffy looking individual whose clothes appeared to be the worse for wear. He would be with us for a fortnight and also stayed in the barn. He was the trapper whose job it was to kill all the rabbits. He had a basket in his hand in which he kept a ferret. I had never seen one before, but it reminded me of a stoat. Next morning after the milking time and breakfast, I set off to work in the long meadow and met him on his way to trap. He had a rope around his waist and on it was a bundle of nets. He explained how he used them and promised to show me. I was engrossed and thought it great fun until I saw him killing and cleaning a rabbit out. That was really disgusting and I never watched him again. It seemed to me that all farming was about killing. I remembered my chickens and the pig hanging up in the chimney, and now the poor little rabbits. We were all working very hard now at this time of the year, and the days were getting longer and longer, also harder. The horses too were working extremely hard back and forth to the fields with their heavy loads. Anyway, one day during one of our tea time chats, George said he was worried about Blossom's foot. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the farmer agreed and said he would get someone in to look at it. One day a horse and cart arrived at the farm, and there was a family living in it. George explained that it was a Romany caravan, and they were true gypsies. The head of the family was a large, well-built, swarthy-looking gentleman who shook hands with George and went into the stables. Apparently he was a charmer and would cure Blossom's foot. I followed them to the stable and saw the man collect a bucket of water into which he poured in a little bottle of liquid. He then knelt down by her foot and took out a penknife and started stabbing the foot all over. It was swollen and huge and looked like a giant honeycomb, and then it started bleeding. That was it. I was gone. I couldn't stay there and watch that going on. I never forgot that scene and it gave me nightmares. My poor Blossom being treated like that. But life went on and we carried on with our harvest. Later on, George was more concerned about Blossom, and I also could see that it looked dreadful. One morning very early we could hear the horses making a dreadful noise. George fell out of bed to get them in. When he checked on them, he discovered that it was Blossom that was crying. She had been through a bad night and had been scratching that hoof against a fence post, which unfortunately was supporting barbed wire. This had become embedded in her leg and foot, and she had dragged it all the way home with the post. I just couldn't stand it and ran off into the fields to let the chickens out and to bring the cows in. I was very upset at the breakfast table, and the farmer tried to explain that this was farm life, and I was to try not to make so much of it. In fact, he kindly suggested I take the dogs and go around the hedges looking for hens' nests. I thoroughly enjoyed being with my three companions, and it helped to take my mind off things. When I got back at tea times, however, George told me Blossom had gone to the hospital. I never saw her again. Later on in the year, a cattle truck arrived at the farm, and when they dropped at the tailgate, out stepped a beautiful chestnut horse. He was a 3-year-old and not quite trained. Anyway, George took him into the stable to meet Farmer. They eyed each other and after a short time accepted each other enough to settle down to munch. George soon began the young colt's training and had named him Prince. He was wearing a halter and bit and a chain harness to get him used to the rattles. One day, while the farmer and George were going to be busy elsewhere, George said he had a special job for me, one that I would enjoy. I went with him to the first field where a fairly large hazel tree had been cut down. George told me to wait there and he would be back. He soon was back with Prince. He harnessed Prince up to the down tree and told me I was to lead him and the tree up and down the field so Prince could get used to the weight and the noise. It was great, and I was in charge. It had been a wonderful day, and I was sorry when it ended. This wasn't my last experience with Prince. I also took him out training with a chain drag, which was even noisier, and to a young horse must have seemed very unnerving to have this trailing behind him. But he proved his worth and became reliable and obedient. And he was soon a working partner with Farmer. At the end of August or early September, We started one of our busiest jobs of the year, threshing corn. A huge steam engine arrived one day, drawing a threshing machine and a large wooden caravan. He placed the caravan in a short meadow near the stream so that his family had ample water for the family purposes. There was a lady and 2 children besides the man. He then drew the machine to our first corn rick and spent a while servicing the engine and checking the drive belts for alignment and tension. When he was satisfied everything was in order, he blew a long whistle on the engine. That was the signal for a group of local farm workers to give us a hand. I had never seen such a beast working before, and the air was filled with noise, heat, and dust. I was given a menial task to perform at the rear of the machine, checking the output of the chaff and keeping the grills unblocked. I became totally covered in chaff, in my eyes, down my shirt and neck, and I was extremely uncomfortable. There was plenty of drink available, but I was not allowed too much. We had plenty of breaks and had our lovely cheese and onion bags. The work went on until dark and for a week or 2 longer, until all 5 ricks were finished and all other duties in between. We used to get local ladies calling at the farm who wanted to move from rick to rick and glean the fallen leftover corn. They would use this for their own needs or to feed their poultry. It was quite a ritual and did a great deal to make the community feel stronger. Everyone worked hard and all were friendly and happy. We also had another serious job to carry out, and that was cider making. As the threshing drew to a close and the tidying up began, the rick thatcher moved in. I wasn't needed, so I was sent to the orchard to gather up all the fallen apples. It became quite a tedious job, and once again boring. The apples were placed into a long wooden trough, which was on wheels, so I could drag it along with me. When filled, I took them to the big barn where the cider press was installed, and tipped them onto the floor, eventually making a huge mound. I had to pick up all the apples, whether they were bruised, full of holes, or in pieces. There were dozens of varieties, but none of them were sweet. As I carried on with my job, the threshing work was completed, and it was time for the Thanksgiving feast. All the workers, along with the engine driver and his family, were seated around a long trestle table which had been set up in the barn, covered with beautiful white sheets and laid up with masses of crockery and drinking glasses. There were also vases of flowers centered on the tables. What totally surprised me was the arrival of the parish priest, who gave the harvest and the mill his blessing. It was a beautiful, thought-provoking occasion. We were communal and grateful for the satisfaction of the work done. Now it was time to prepare the press for making cider, and there was much preparation to be done. The farmer had a stock of worn-out West of England sacks which were to be used. We were given a bundle each and a penknife. What we had to do was slit the sides of the sacks down to form an open piece of material. The working parts of the press were cleaned and the ironworks thoroughly oiled and greased. The press was in 2 parts, a top and bottom with really huge blocks of oak timber. The farmer raised the top part, and when it was far enough apart, he placed a wooden frame on the lower block with a sheet of sacking at the bottom. We then filled the frame with apples until full. The sheet of sacking was drawn up over the apples and formed into an envelope. Another frame was placed on top, and the same process repeated over and over again until we reached the top of the press. The farmer wound the top block down onto the apples to put pressure on them, which he did daily, and soon the juices started to run into a vat which was filled with straw to act as a filter. The juice gradually filled huge barrels. The press was changed several times until all the apples were through. The wasted apple pulp and straw pads were used as animal feed. It was a very interesting process, and I was glad when it was all over, and the barrels stacked and left for months to brew and ferment. George told me the barrels had to be fed with raw meat, even dead rats. I'm sure he was kidding me. Or was he? As time went on, I became more and more experienced, and many times I was left to my own devices. I also began to get the wanderlust. George lived locally and was able to go home on weekends, which I thought was marvelous. I used to give him my pocket money and he would bring me bags of toffees. My evenings and weekends were limited to the area of the farmland, and I was even allowed to cross neighbors' grasslands, but I envied George and his freedom and wondered whether I could enjoy some of the same. I eventually had permission to walk into town on Saturday evenings to visit the cinema and meet other lads. It was great, and my life was expanding. I made good friends and looked forward to the times when we could meet. They weren't all farm lads. One boy was an apprentice to the local blacksmith, and I was invited to watch them at work one evening. It was great stuff. Some of the others worked at the dairy factory, but they weren't too happy about it. It was hard work with little pay, much like my job. When I did walk into town, it was at the time of the blackout, and everywhere was dark and creepy. I was walking home one night on my own and was quite frightened. There was no light anywhere, when suddenly something moved in the hedgerow. It really frightened me very much, and I was petrified, but I found out it was just cattle in the field. What a relief. Another night, I was making my way home when there was a bombing raid on Exeter. The whole sky was illuminated with flares and searchlights, and I could see the flames rising up into the sky. Aircraft were flying over me, and I heard ack guns blazing away. But for some reason, I was not afraid. If it wasn't for the awesome truth of what was going on in Exeter, the lighting and smoke effects were quite exhilarating. I stood there watching and was mesmerized by it all. Then one day, George dropped a dreadful bombshell. He had applied for and got a new job in Devon. He would be leaving at the end of the month and was looking forward to it. I was dumbfounded and really frightened. George had been my closest companion and tutor, and now I was to lose him. What was I going to do? What would his replacement be like? Things would never be the same again. I carried on working with George, and he spent a lot of time with me evenings, giving me advice on how I was to work, and perhaps one day approached the farmer to see if I could be put in charge of the horses. Then came the day that George left, but I had been discreetly sent up to Longmeadow and didn't even get the chance to say goodbye. I would never forgive the farmer and his wife for that. I went about my work as best I could, but my heart wasn't in it. It seemed that jobs were piled on higher and higher, and my days were getting longer. Then, one Saturday evening, one of my new friends told me he was leaving the town and going to work on the railway at Taunton. That was it. I made up my mind. I was going to do the same. I had to make plans and choose the right time. The opportunity arose when the farmer and his wife went to Bidford Market, and I was on my own. I went into the house, picked up some bread, cheese, and a bottle of cider, my best jacket, and off I went, up to the long meadow and on and on. I kept to the fields, crossing them in what I thought was the right direction, and keeping well away from the roads. At night I found a hayrick or barn and made myself cozy to spend the night. I was soon far away, but my food was gone, and I was getting cold. Had I done the right thing? Were they searching for me? I began to get worried about what I had done, but then the thought of a new start in life prevailed, and I pressed on and eventually reached Taunton. I was about to start again. I had my future before me.